The scream that tore through the ER at Metropolitan Trauma wasn't from a patient, and the woman standing motionless in the center of the chaos, holding a stainless steel tray with the steady hand of a master and the cold, unblinking eyes of a judge, certainly wasn't a victim. For years, the staff at Metropolitan thought Iris Monroe was just a background character, the quiet, reliable nurse who never missed a shift and never raised her voice. They saw a woman who was compliant, a woman who was invisible, a woman who was weak. They were dead wrong. When Marcus Holt and the Six stormed the ward, he thought he was the apex predator taking control of a slaughterhouse. He didn't know he had just barricaded himself in a glass box with the only person the dragon of the Lee Syndicate would burn the city down to protect. This is the story of the night the gunman realized that the most dangerous place in the world isn't a dark alley in the underbelly of Seoul. It's the trauma ward of a woman who has spent years perfecting the art of being a ghost. It was a Tuesday night, the air thick with the smell of industrial bleach and the frantic pulse of a mass casualty event. Iris Monroe sat at the intake desk, the cool fluorescent light reflecting in her dark, calculating eyes. To the doctors and residents, Iris was a non-entity. She was 32. Her scrubs impeccably pressed, her hair in a severe functional bun that allowed her to blend into the white walls. She walked with a soft, unassuming grace, rounding her shoulders as if to apologize for taking up space. "She's like a robot, I swear," whispered Lydia, leaning against the medication cart while checking her reflection. "I asked her what her husband does for a living, and she said logistics. Can you imagine anything more boring?" Dr. Reed, the senior lead, didn't even look up from his tablet. He was brilliant, stressed, and far too arrogant to see the person standing right in front of him. "As long as she doesn't get in the way of the high-profile intake in Bay 4, I don't care if she's a mannequin. Just keep her away from the press. She doesn't have the presence for it." Reed was focused on the trauma charts. He didn't notice that while Iris appeared to be logging vitals, she was actually calculating the firing angles of the exits. He didn't notice that when Marcus Holt burst through the double doors screaming for blood, Iris didn't flinch. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy supply bag that didn't just contain bandages. And he certainly didn't notice the formal, expensive sleeve of a man stepping out of the shadows, placing a calm, possessive hand on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet ownership from Lee Tae-Gwon himself. Iris typed her last note: "ER secure. Threat neutralized in T-minus 60 seconds. She wasn't afraid. The wolves were finally at the door, and she was the one who held the key. The ER at Metropolitan Trauma was usually a sanctuary of sterile lines and predictable rhythms, but the air tonight felt heavy, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. Iris moved through the ward with a practiced, rounded-shouldered shuffle, her eyes downcast as she prepped a tray of saline bags. Around her, Marcus Holt's men were a whirlwind of noise and unearned confidence, their boots scuffing the tiles she had seen scrubbed clean 1,000 times. As she worked, the cold metallic scent of the oxygen tanks triggered a memory that didn't belong in a trauma center, a memory of the secret vow that had defined the last 3 years of her life. It hadn't been a wedding of white lace and church bells. It had happened at midnight in a private garden in Seoul, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken promise of violence. Iris had worn a black silk hanbok, her hand trembling only slightly as it rested in Lee Tae-Gwon's. He hadn't looked like a dragon then. He had looked like a man seeking a single point of purity in a world made of filth. "I don't want you in the syndicate, Iris," he had whispered, his voice a low melodic vibration that seemed to anchor her soul. You will be the one thing I don't have to protect with a gun. You will be the healer, and I will be the shield that ensures no one ever sees you. The logistics of their marriage were clinical, almost tactical. To the world, they didn't exist. There were no shared bank accounts, no social media tags, and certainly no visits to the hospital. Tae-Gwon had built a wall of invisible authority around her, ensuring that the only life Iris led was the one she chose, the one where she was just a nurse who meal prepped on Sundays and apologized for taking up space in the break room. "Iris, are you even listening?" Lydia's voice snapped her back to the present. The other nurse was huddled behind the medication cart, her face pale with terror. "The gunman, Holt, he's gonna kill us all, and you're just standing there looking at the IV bags like you're bored." Iris didn't look at Lydia. She looked at the reflection of Marcus Holt in the glass of the trauma bay. He was a brittle man, his power derived from the heavy iron in his hand, whereas the power Iris had spent 3 years suppressing was a sovereign asset that couldn't be broken by a bullet. "He's not gonna kill anyone," Iris said, her voice so calm it sounded like a death sentence. The secret vow was more than a promise of peace, it was a pact of silence. Tae-Gwon had promised to stay in the shadows as long as her world remained clean, but as Marcus Holt leveled his weapon at Dr. Reed, Iris felt the logistics of the dragon shifting in her blood. The air in the ward grew arctic, the invisible nurse was gone, and the woman who had married the King of Soul was finally waking up. She reached for a heavy supply bag tucked under the intake desk, a bag that contained more than just bandages. It was the physical manifestation of her husband's protection, a toolkit of lethal precision she had promised never to touch. As the gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, Iris shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. The vow was broken. The light was fading, and Marcus Holt was about to realize that logistics was just another word for an expertly planned execution. The ER hissed with the mechanical groan of the heavy double doors locking into place. Marcus Holt stood in the center of the triage bay, his chest heaving, the noise versus silence dynamic now tilted entirely in his favor, or so he thought. He had severed the external phone lines and jammed the cellular frequencies, believing he had turned the hospital into a soundproof tomb. Iris stood by the medication dispensing station, her back to the gunman. Her posture remained that of the NPC, shoulders slightly rounded, head bowed. But beneath the counter, her fingers were not reaching for gauze. They were dancing across a hidden interface on the hospital's central tablet. "I want the VIP," Holt roared, his chest heaving off the sterile tiles. Iris didn't look up. She was busy executing the lockdown on her own terms. She knew the hospital's hidden bones better than the architects. With a few clinical swipes, she bypassed the administrative firewalls. She wasn't just locking doors, she was segmenting the ward. She engaged the magnetic fire doors in the North Hall, effectively cutting off Maddox and Rook from their leader. The internal cooling system hummed, a low-frequency vibration that Iris manipulated to mask the sound of her movements. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the dragon's wife, utilizing the hospital's infrastructure as a tactical weapon. She rerouted the elevator power to the basement, trapping Silas in a steel cage between floors. "Lydia, stay down," Iris whispered, her voice barely a breath. Lydia looked up from the floor, her eyes wide with terror that turned to confusion. She saw Iris, but the quiet nurse was gone. Iris's eyes were no longer dull with the exhaustion of the graveyard shift. They were sharp, calculating, and possessed an invisible authority that made the air around her feel frigid. "The cameras," Lydia stammered, pointing at the blinking red eyes in the ceiling. "They're mine now." Iris replied. On the tablet, the security feeds flickered. Holt was still screaming at Dr. Reed, unaware that he was being funneled into a kill zone of Iris's design. She dimmed the lights in the west wing, leaving only the blue emergency strobes, turning the familiar ward into a labyrinth of shadows. Marcus Holt turned, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The noise of his triumph was being swallowed by a surgical pulse of silence. He looked at Iris, who finally turned to face him. She wasn't hiding behind the desk anymore. She stood upright, her silhouette framed by the flickering blue light. "The hospital is closed, Marcus," Iris said, her voice a melodic vibration of cold command. "And you don't have an appointment." The air in the west wing had grown thin, vibrating with the mechanical hum of a building turned against its occupants. Iris moved through the semi-darkness of the corridor, her blue scrubs blending into the shadows cast by the flickering emergency strobes. Behind her, she could hear the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots, Silas and Grim. They were moving with the overconfidence of men who believed they were hunting a frightened rabbit, unaware that they were being funneled into the triage trap. Iris reached the heavy, airtight doors of the hyperbaric and oxygen therapy suite. She didn't hide. She stood for a split second in the center of the frame, letting the beam of Silas's weapon-mounted light catch the NPC mask of her face before she slipped inside. "She's in the tank room," Grim barked, his voice distorted by the adrenaline of the chase. They burst through the doors, weapons raised, their silhouettes framed by the high-pressure oxygen tanks that lined the walls like silent sentinels. The room was a labyrinth of steel pipes and hissing valves. Iris was nowhere to be seen, but the sound of her practiced soft shuffle echoed from the back of the chamber. "Nowhere left to run, little nurse," Silas sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger as he rounded a massive cylindrical tank. He didn't notice the hiss had changed frequency. Beneath the floorboards, Iris had accessed the manual override for the room's atmospheric seals. With a clinical swipe of her tablet, she had triggered a pressure spike. The heavy doors behind the gunman slammed shut with a vacuum seal that made the air in the room turn heavy and thick. "What the?" Grim gasped, clutching his throat as the oxygen saturation in the room spiked to 300%. In a high-pressure, oxygen-rich environment, the physics of violence change. The logic of the war dictates that a single spark becomes an inferno. Iris stepped out from behind a central console, her face illuminated by the green glow of the pressure gauges. She wasn't holding a gun, she was holding a heavy industrial wrench she had taken from the maintenance kit. "Don't fire," Iris warned, her voice echoing with an invisible authority that chilled the boiling air. "The oxygen levels are high enough that the static from your firing pin will turn this room into a furnace. You aren't in a ward anymore, gentlemen. You're inside a bomb." Silas froze, his weapon trembling. The noise of his aggression was replaced by the terrifying realization that his superior firepower was now his greatest liability. Grim slumped against a tank, the rapid pressure change causing his vision to tunnel and his lungs to burn. Iris moved toward them, her balance perfect, her expression composed. She didn't need a bullet to neutralize them. She had used the hospital's own life-saving breath to suffocate their will to fight. The pressurized silence of the oxygen suite was suddenly shattered by the low gravelly chime of the hospital's intercom system. It wasn't an emergency alert or a page for a doctor. It was a sequence of 5 melodic tones, the signature of the Lee Syndicate's private communication channel. Iris stood perfectly still as the security monitors in the room flickered to life. The feed didn't show the grainy footage of the hospital halls. It showed a high-definition bird's-eye view of the facility, overlaid with tactical data and heat signatures. Every gunman in the building was highlighted in a pulsing, predatory red. Then, the heavy airtight doors behind Iris didn't just unlock, they glided open with a silent, expensive smoothness that the hospital's maintenance budget could never have afforded. A figure stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. He wasn't wearing scrubs or tactical gear. He wore a hand-tailored charcoal gray suit that seemed to absorb the flickering blue emergency lights. Lee Tae-Gwon didn't shout, he didn't raise a weapon. His quiet authority was so immense that Silas and Grim, still gasping for air on the floor, instinctively tried to crawl backwards, their eyes wide with the realization that the dragon had entered the den. Tae-Gwon walked across the room, his footsteps rhythmic and heavy, until he stood directly behind Iris. He reached out, his hand, clad in the crisp white cuff of a dress shirt, resting calmly and firmly on her shoulder. The gesture was not of protection, but of implied authority. It was a claim. It told the room, the gunman, and the terrified staff watching through the glass that the quiet nurse was the most protected asset in the city. The physical connection shifted the power dynamic of the entire ward. Iris's relaxed shoulders under his touch communicated that the NPC mask was no longer necessary. "You've been busy, Iris," Tae-Gwon murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to calm the very air in the room. He didn't look at the gunman, he looked at the back of his wife's head with a terrifying, possessive pride. "I told you that if the world ever stained your sanctuary, I would come to burn the stains away." Iris leaned slightly into the weight of his hand, her eyes locked on Silas. "The stains are already contained, Tae-Gwon. I just need you to help with the disposal." Through the monitors, the hospital's PA system crackled again, but this time it was Tae-Gwon's voice, not Iris's, that filled the halls. It was a cold, melodic promise of retribution that made Marcus Holt drop his weapon in the lobby. The visible authority of the dragon had arrived, and as Iris felt the strength of her husband behind her, she realized the secret vow hadn't just been about her safety. It had been about the moment the world finally realized who she was. The nursing station, once a place of mundane gossip and shift change reports, had become a barricade. Lydia Perez and Hannah Moore were huddled beneath the heavy mahogany desk, their breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that fogged the plexiglass shield. The ER hummed with a different kind of tension now, the triage pulse of a building being purged. Jax, the most volatile of Marcus Holt's crew, stalked towards the station. He was raw emotion embodied, his grip on his weapon white-knuckled and frantic. He didn't see a threat, he saw 3 women trapped in a corner. "Where is Silas? What did you do to the comms?" he screamed, his voice cracking with the brittleness of a man losing control. Iris didn't answer. She stood in front of the desk, her posture upright and steady, her eyes locked on Jax with a calm that was almost unsettling. She wasn't holding a gun, but the invisible authority radiating from her made Jax hesitate. Her hands moved with a surgical pulse, reaching not for a weapon, but for the heavy supply bag she had been clutching. "Get out of the way, nurse," Jax roared, lunging forward. Iris acted. She didn't move like a victim, she moved like a sovereign asset. In one fluid motion, she ripped a canister of pressurized medical-grade adhesive from her bag. As Jax reached for her, she triggered the valve, spraying the quick-set polymer directly into his eyes and across the firing mechanism of his weapon. Before he could scream, she grabbed a heavy, stainless steel surgical tray. Using the logic of the scalpel, she didn't swing wildly. She used the edge of the tray to strike the nerve cluster in his wrist, sending his gun clattering across the sterile tiles. Lydia and Hannah watched from below, their faces pale with a profound, watchful silence. They were seeing the NPC mask fall away, replaced by a woman who understood the logic of violence better than the man currently choking on his own rage. Iris stepped over the half-blinded Jax, her expression composed. She reached into the medication cart and pulled out a sedative-loaded auto-injector. "You're agitated, Jax," she said, her voice a low, melodic vibration of quiet authority. "I think it's time for your vitals to drop." She drove the injector into his thigh with clinical precision. Within seconds, his chaotic movements stilled, his body slumping against the very medication cart Hannah had once used to hide her phone. Iris didn't look at her colleagues for praise. She checked the seal on her gloves and adjusted the stethoscope around her neck. "Lydia, Hannah, get the restraints from the supply closet. He won't be waking up for a few hours." She turned toward the corridor, the blue emergency strobes reflecting in her dark, calculating eyes. The nursing station stand was over, but the blackout operation was just beginning. The overhead lights didn't just turn off, they vanished, swallowed by a total grid wipe that Iris had initiated from the central hub. The emergency strobes, which had been flickering in a frantic red, were now silenced. The hospital plunged into darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight, a logic of the abyss that stripped the gunmen of their primary advantage. Iris stood at the edge of the darkened hallway, her breathing so shallow it wouldn't have stirred a candle flame. She wasn't using a flashlight, she was navigating by the invisible training she had suppressed for years, moving by the tactile memory of the floor tiles and the micro-vibrations of the building's ventilation. "I can't see a damned thing," Rook's voice hissed from 20 feet away, followed by the frantic mechanical click of a tactical light being toggled. The beam cut through the dark, a frantic white needle searching for a target. Iris didn't flinch. She was already horizontal, braced against the wall in a shadowed alcove. She watched the beam pass over her, the light failing to register her form because she had become part of the environment. In the dark, the quiet nurse was no longer a victim, she was the ultimate predator. She moved with a surgical pulse, closing the distance while Rook struggled with his gear. He was a professional, but he was trained for wars with clear lines of sight. He wasn't prepared for a woman who could move like water through stone. Iris reached into her supply bag and pulled out a heavy-duty fiberglass restraint, a sovereign asset from the psych ward. Before Rook could sweep his light back toward her, Iris was in her personal space. She didn't use a blade, she used the dark. She struck the pressure point behind his ear with clinical force, and as he stumbled, she looped the restraint around his wrists and the metal railing of a gurney in one fluid, rhythmic motion. "Rook, status," Maddox's voice crackled over the radio, sounding small and tinny in the vast silence of the ward. Iris picked up the fallen radio, her finger hovering over the transmit button. She didn't speak. Instead, she tapped out a rhythmic code against the receiver, the same dragon signature Tae-Gwon had used on the intercom. It was a psychological strike, a tactical noir message that told the remaining gunmen they were no longer the ones doing the hunting. She melted back into the shadows, heading toward the lobby. The blackout operation was ahead of schedule. The gunmen were blind, panicked, and segmented. As she moved, she felt the cold, exhilarating reality of her power. She wasn't hiding from the fire anymore. She was the shadow that would eventually extinguish it. The silence of the blackout was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. Outside the reinforced glass of the lobby, the rainy night was suddenly pierced by the rhythmic, blinding strobes of dozens of obsidian-black SUVs. They didn't arrive with sirens, they arrived with the heavy, mechanical hum of high-performance engines that vibrated through the hospital's very foundation. This was the Black Unit, the elite physical manifestation of Lee Tae-Gwon's power, and as they formed a seamless perimeter around the building, the two worlds, the sterile sanctuary of medicine and the iron-fisted reality of the Syndicate, finally collided. Iris stood in the center of the lobby, her blue medical scrubs a stark contrast to the tactical charcoal suits of the men now pouring through the shattered entrance. The noise of the gunmen's siege had been replaced by a surgical pulse of disciplined movement. Marcus Holt, once the self-proclaimed apex predator, looked like a broken child as he was forced to his knees by two of Tae-Gwon's lieutenants. Lee Tae-Gwon walked through the center of the formation, his hand-tailored suit absorbing the flickering red emergency lights. He didn't look at the carnage or the cowering staff, his eyes were locked on Iris. He stopped inches from her, his quiet authority radiating a heat that pushed back the clinical chill of the ward. "The perimeter is secure, Iris," Lee Tae-Gwon said, his voice a low melodic vibration that seemed to command the shadows themselves. "The men who dared to stain this floor are being relocated. But the world saw you tonight. They saw the dragon's wife instead of the quiet nurse." Iris looked around the lobby. She saw Dr. Reed staring at her with a profound, watchful silence. She saw Lydia and Hannah, their faces pale with the realization that the woman they had mocked for her boring life was the one who had just saved their lives using the power of a king. The invisible authority was no longer a secret. It was a physical reality, anchored by the man standing behind her. "I didn't do it for the world, Tae-Gwon," Iris replied, her voice steady and commanding. She reached out and adjusted the lapel of his suit, an act of implied authority that told everyone in the room exactly where the power truly sat. Tae-Gwon's hand settled on her shoulder, the familiar weight of his claim a reassurance in the chaos. The secret vow had been burned away by the gunman's bullets, leaving behind a new, terrifyingly beautiful truth. The intersection of her two worlds was complete. As the black unit began the final sweep of the building, Iris realized she was no longer a woman living a double life. She was the bridge between the healer and the hunter, the visible queen of Metropolitan Trauma. The lobby of Metropolitan Trauma had been transformed into a cold clinical court. The high-ceilinged room was bathed in the rhythmic blue and red strobes of the black unit's perimeter, casting long, shifting shadows against the white marble. Marcus Holt sat in the center of the floor, his hands zip-tied, his raw emotion now a hollow, vibrating terror. He looked up as the heavy glass doors of the West Wing hissed open. Iris walked toward him, the NPC shuffle replaced by a stride of sovereign precision. Beside her, Lee Tae-Gwon moved like a silent storm, his hand never leaving her shoulder, a physical anchor of implied authority. The Syndicate lieutenant stepped back, creating a circle of profound, watchful silence. Tae-Gwon stopped a few feet from Holt and looked at Iris. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a slim, velvet-lined case. He didn't offer her a gun. He opened the case to reveal a surgical scalpel, its high carbon steel gleaming with a lethal, sterile light. "The mask you wore for 3 years was a gift to this city, Iris," Tae-Gwon murmured, his voice a melodic vibration of cold judgment. "But he tried to tear it off. In my world, the price for that is blood. In yours, it is a choice. You are the healer. You decide the logic of the scalpel tonight." Iris took the instrument. The weight was familiar, grounding her in her dual identity as a lifesaver and a protector. She stepped into Holt's personal space, the tip of the blade hovering just inches from his jugular. The gunman's breath hitched, a noise of pure desperation. "You thought you were entering a slaughterhouse, Marcus," Iris said, her voice so steady it chilled the room. "You thought the woman in the blue scrubs was a non-entity because she didn't scream. You mistook my restraint for weakness." She leaned closer, the blade grazing the skin of his neck, just enough to draw a single clinical bead of red. For a heartbeat, the room expected the execution. Tae-Gwon's eyes burned with a dark, possessive pride, waiting for his queen to claim her first kill. But Iris didn't pull the blade across. Instead, she used the scalpel to surgically slice the zip ties from his wrists with a single lightning-fast flick. "I am a nurse, Marcus. I don't take lives. I decide who is worth saving," she whispered. She stepped back, handing the scalpel back to her husband without looking away from Holt. "Tae-Gwon, he doesn't deserve the logic of the scalpel. He deserves the logic of the law. Hand him to the authorities, but ensure his record is detailed. Make sure every cell he sits in knows he was defeated by a nurse." Holt collapsed into a heap of relief and shame, realized that being spared by Iris was a far more crushing defeat than death. Tae-Gwon closed the case, his quiet authority shifting into a deep, resonant respect. He didn't care about the mercy, he cared that she had exercised her own visible authority over the moment. The price of the mask had been paid. Iris looked at Dr. Reed and the cowering staff, her face composed and upright. She wasn't hiding behind the dragon anymore. She was standing in the center of her own empire. 1 year later, the atmosphere in the West Wing of Metropolitan Trauma had undergone a fundamental shift. The flickering, unreliable amber lights had been replaced by a state-of-the-art surgical lighting system, and the scent of industrial bleach was now softened by the faint, expensive aroma of sandalwood, the signature of the Lee Syndicate's silent patronage. Iris Monroe stood at the center of the redesigned nursing station, no longer a woman trying to disappear into the paint of the walls. She wore a deep navy set of scrubs, tailored and crisp as a military uniform. Her shoulders were squared, and her eyes, once dark and calculating in the shadows, now held the bright, steady flame of a woman who owned every square inch of the floor. Dr. Reed stood by the medication cart, but he wasn't barking orders or ignoring the staff. He was waiting. He held a slight tremor of respect, watching as Iris finished her review of the morning's trauma intakes. When she finally looked up, the NPC mask was nowhere to be found. "The staffing ratios for the night shift are inadequate, Dr. Reed," Iris said, her voice a low, melodic vibration of visible authority. "I've already authorized the overtime. My husband's logistics team has also delivered the new ventilators to Bay 4. See that they are calibrated by noon." "Of course, Iris," Reed replied, his voice quiet and genuinely respectful. He handed her a small plastic-wrapped box. "The hospital board sent this up. They said it's a formality, but we both know it's a recognition." Iris opened the box. Inside was a new name badge, the plastic gleaming under the high-intensity lights. It didn't just say Iris Monroe, RN. In bold, clear letters, it read, "Iris Monroe, Charge Nurse." Lydia and Hannah stood nearby, no longer scrolling through their phones or whispering about boring lives. They stood straight, their eyes reflecting a profound, watchful silence as they waited for their assignments. They didn't just see a nurse anymore, they saw the visible queen who had navigated a blackout to save their lives. "Does this mean more paperwork, Iris?" Hannah joked, though her voice lacked its old bite. "It means the ward is mine," Iris replied, her voice steady and commanding. She clipped the badge to her scrubs. Through the reinforced glass window of the lobby, she saw a single obsidian-black SUV idling at the curb. Lee Tae-Gwon didn't step out, and he didn't need to. The implied authority of the vehicle was a silent acknowledgement from the dragon to his queen, a promise that the sanctuary she ruled would never be stained again. Iris turned back to her team, the logic of the scalpel now applied to the management of human life. "Show's over. We have a mass casualty transport arriving in 10 minutes. Let's get to work." The quiet nurse was dead. The visible queen had arrived, and as she stepped toward the intake doors, Iris Monroe finally knew exactly who she was. She was the healer, she was the strategist, and she was the woman who had turned a slaughterhouse back into a sanctuary. Thanks for watching Boss Hidden Chronicles. If this story pulled you into the shadows of power, secrets, and hidden strength, you're in the right place. Here, we uncover the stories no one dares to tell, where quiet people change everything, and the truth always comes at a cost. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, because every boss has a hidden chronicle waiting to be revealed.